You've said before that the goal when you're painting is the finished work. So do you have this in mind when you set out, or does it develop as it goes along?
I think some of the earlier works, I definitely had a very kind of specific idea of what the finished item would look like, and maybe that became too restrictive. So the newer works don't necessarily enter into that kind of framework.
When you're working on one of your portraits, like the ones behind you now, are you using photographs? Or
Well, for me, I tend to spend a lot of time with the person beforehand, and through that kind of process of kind of exploration of just spending time with them, I then take a whole kind of series of photographs. I do sketches as well. But for me, I'm kind of more interested in being in their environment rather than them being in my environment. The idea of them sitting here for months, I kind of think becomes more about me rather than about them. The paintings come about really through, they're a composite of many different aspects, and these are kind of the finished results really.
So what aspects are you trying to capture when you're making, I mean obviously they do look very much like the person, but is there something you're trying to pull out, like psychology, certain characteristics?
Well, I think within this exhibition that all the portraits were exactly the same size. They all have the same crop. So they're non-hierarchical, the eye line is all constant throughout all of them. They're all people that I have some form of relationship with, and they're all people who I think have a very discerning eye. And so it's their relationship to image, in a way. And us as the viewer will become the viewed, in a sense, because all the portraits are shown in one space, so you will be immersed within that very kind of specific gaze of all these people who I believe have a very particular kind of view on the world, whether they be kind of like Don McCullin, the war photographer, Erdem, fashion designer, or Malcolm Venville, Mark Newson, the designer. So there's a kind of a parity of thought throughout all of them. And of course, you probably know what they do, but you don't necessarily know who they are visually.
Can you say a little more about the crop, because it is quite a specific crop, very close up in the face?
Yeah, I mean, I've always been interested. I think every portrait I've made has been cropped in one way, shape or another. And so I've always been fascinated with the kind of cinematic kind of crop. And I expect, growing up in a period of watching Sergio Leone films with that very tight crop. And for me, they become less portrait-like and it intensifies the gaze. So that, for me, is key to them. They're not society portraits. They reveal everything in a world that wants to almost eradicate detail by airbrushing it out. I'm kind of interested in airbrushing it in, because otherwise I think we're on a slippery slope.
And the black and white, is that a cinematic decision as well?
It's part of that, yeah. I mean, I think initially they came from a point of trying to combine the maximal and the minimal at the same time. So they're just made using black paint. There's no white paint in them. The white is purely the background showing through. So you can achieve a lot via very little. Also, every single one of them is, you could make the idea that they're all unfinished in some way, shape or form. I.e., there's a section on all of them that I've got to a point where I kind of think, well, I don't need to paint anymore. It's not about starting at X and finishing at Y in order to prove that I can paint a scarf or a bit of jumper. When they're done, they're done. But also that there's potential metaphors within that. The fact that they deconstruct themselves, so you're very aware of how they've been constructed, but also maybe they allude to the fact of how fugitive things are.
You just mentioned deconstructing, and the title of the show is going to be "The Subject is Not the Subject,"
Yep.
which is quite postmodern in itself.
Yeah, well, yeah. I mean, I expect it is. I mean, I come out of that generation, and I expect it's about looking or exploring the painted language, and about taking one art object and through a process of exploration, how you can hopefully change the way we see that thing. And so within the show, there are 3 component parts, shown in 3 separate galleries, and they all have a common thread throughout all of them. That being that the subject is not the subject. i.e. the source material that I initially start with is maybe not what you initially think it is, but I think there's a consistent vision throughout all three pieces of work that hopefully prove that the subject is not the subject. Yeah, so there's a whole series of landscapes, and all the landscapes are based on, I have an obsession and a love for amateur, hobbyist, thrift store, car boot paintings. And I've been collecting them for probably the last 15, 20 years. So I have quite a collection of them. For me, it's about taking those objects, I start as a starting point, and going on a journey with them. So I remake them. But for me, I'm interested in the language that is being used within them. So for me, I see landscape through these paintings. I don't necessarily see it through the actual landscape. So whereas Turner may have been inspired by a sunset, I'm inspired by finding a painting that I think has a huge interest within it, and then I go on a journey with that.
But you're obviously not just remaking that painting, you're changing the size and perhaps working on just the detail of it.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. So I, for me, those paintings are, and I'm not comparing myself, but the way kind of Picasso looked at childhood for inspiration. For me, I'm interested in the way these small kind of vignettes have been crafted, and yet they're kind of imbued with love and a desire to succeed, but often, failure's just around the corner, and yet there's such an intensity within them. And I grew up kind of with those kind of paintings on the wall. I didn't grow up with high art, in Yorkshire. It was very much about this kind of aesthetic. But that they kind of give rise to ways of describing things that I may never have thought about, in terms of being able to describe a lake or a piece of water. But you can also often see their influences writ large within what their kind of inspiration's been.
And when you're making a painting like this, it's a variety of different techniques that you're using. So, from here it looks very much like it's stick and 3D and impasto.
Yeah.
But it's actually not all, is it?
No. So the idea of making a painting, or making paintings that describe the language of painting or tap into that, or it's an exploration of that, almost like a meta language. So within these paintings, there is airbrush, there is acrylic, there is oil, and it's about trying to coalesce all of those aspects within one kind of arena. Yeah, the starting point is often an airbrush painting that plays within certain kind of trompe-l'oeil styles, but then there's the oil sections which are put through stencils as well. So they're not necessarily just a gratuitous mark, they're actually quite a contrived gratuitous mark. And so it gives rise to a very specific kind of edge. So nothing is what you think it is, and often it's about, obviously when you take a JPEG of these things and the way we access things now, you probably wouldn't really know what you're looking at, and hence, the subject is not the subject.
So it's very important really for people to actually come and see the works and look close rather than just rely on social media or reproductions.
Yeah, obviously everything has its place, but I kind of, I'm immersed within the process of the tactile, and so for me, I'm kind of interested in people seeing the actual thing, and because I think it's a different experience, not only in terms of scale, but as you say, in terms of the actual surface of it, and therefore what that gives rise to in terms of the dialogue that you could have with it, because it becomes part of its subtext in terms of the way you decipher it. These are a good example of some of the things that I found over the years, and so probably about 10 years ago I found this painting, which for me, I kind of felt had a relationship to the Hay Wain. But obviously it was almost as if it had been flipped. So Willie Lott's cottage, maybe that was the real Willie Lott's cottage on the right-hand side. So I became kind of fascinated with this thing and some of the kind of visual decisions that had been made in relation to kind of like the waterfall or the water receding into the background. And then, 5 years later, on exactly the same piece of board, and therefore the same surface and texture, I found another one. But the interesting thing is if you put them together, the line of the bottom foliage joins, and so does the water therefore. So this, for me, then, the idea of creating a diptych. So there is a painting in the show that is homage to these two things, and potentially, hopefully reimagines of what the Hay Wain is like, left and right, and not just so it becomes more cinematic. These things for me are incredibly precious. So it's not about comparing and contrasting. Because I think growing up within art history, and it's very difficult, therefore, to not see things with those visual images kind of embedded within your mind. So therefore, I've always really struggled with the idea of kind of landscape and potentially wanting to paint it, but the notion of being outside painting plein air just makes no sense to me, because I couldn't justify it. And but by seeing these things and having as a source of inspiration, that takes me on a different journey. And then through seeing these, I kind of see landscape in the real world in a different way. And hopefully, through this process, throughout all the works, hopefully the audience will re-see the initial source material in a different way, and not take them as given.
But there must be a relationship perhaps between trompe-l'oeil and then the photorealism in the portraits.
Yeah, I really dislike that word for photorealism.
Sorry.
Yeah, I don't know, it's fine, it's just one of those kind of bugbears,
Maybe it's a trompe-l'oeil portrait in a way, because it makes it really does look like it's actually the person.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, it's hard trying to avoid stereotypes and those kind of words. I mean, photorealism for me was very much a period of work that happened in the 70s onwards, and was very much about the popular image. So, I often try and shy away from that terminology. But it's just about, kind of exploring and taking on board all aspects of the painted language, and hopefully kind of taking it somewhere else. And, I think fundamentally it's about being part of a bigger conversation. And I think, which is hopefully art history, and no matter how big or small your part is, the notion of being a part of that is an incredibly privileged position. So.
You've spoken before about an irritant factor, that is something you think is necessary to keep in a painting.
You've done your homework. Yeah.
Can you say a little bit more about what that is?
Yeah, I think the notion of having an irritant factor is it's about having something that creates a frisson within the work, so it doesn't just flatline. And that could be many things. It necessarily may not be the same thing to everyone. I think it's also a device, when you're in the studio and you're working things out, not only physically but also mentally, you've got to kind of put in place certain devices that keep you sane or not. So the idea of an irritant factor, it could be many things. It's not one specific thing, but it's about trying to give a particular work a charge in some way.
You've also said before about how you spend a lot of time explaining the work and what it means, but actually you'd rather just let the work go out there and other people come and decipher it for themselves.
Yeah, I think sometimes you can say too much, and then you kind of you know, it becomes my take on it. And, you know, it is a visual language, and obviously within that, it's about communication, but I'm kind of probably more interested in what other people think of it rather than necessarily what I've got to say about it. Because, you know, in a way, they're not finished things. They're open to discourse, and you know that it's about a journey, and a journey that's kind of slightly open-ended. So through that dialogue with the audience, you know, it may change the way your work, you know, develops.
How do you know when it's finished? Is it purely a matter of it having to be in the gallery on a certain day? Or?
It's one of those things that I've been asked before, and I kind of know when it's finished. It's like an irritant to myself. It's just, you know, certain things which can be a nightmare for the gallery that I'm exhibiting with, that, you know, to them it may look no different, but to me it's kind of massively different. So, yeah, it's an unanswerable question, unfortunately.
Yeah. You're also making sculptures.
Yep, there's a whole room which is based on my other fascination, which is 18th, 19th, 17th century devotional kind of objects and imagery. And so there will be a large sculpture within that space, which is based on a 19th century bust. It's of the Virgin Mary. She's veiled. But I kind of think the notion of, or devotion, and what we think about that now, it's a very relevant time to be kind of looking at some of those images within the bigger picture of what's happening around the world.